The signal was not meant for them, which was precisely why the Lumina Collective took notice. It arrived not as a crackle of radio waves or a structured pulse of light, but as a stain, a psychic bleed spreading through the serene substrate of space-time. For eons, the Lumina had curated the galaxy, their consciousness a silent, glittering ocean from which they observed the slow, predictable evolution of life. They were not gods, but gardeners, tending the vast, dark soil of the cosmos, pruning species that grew too aggressively and gently nurturing those with the potential for true enlightenment. They measured progress in the slow, graceful arc toward cosmic unity, a state most species achieved or perished long before discovering fire. But this signal, this raw, unfiltered broadcast from a muddy little world in an unfashionable spiral arm, was an anomaly. It was a scream of pure, undiluted chaos. It wasn't the sound of a species dying. It was the sound of a species thriving on its own self-destruction. From their vantage point in the cold, clear void, the collective turned its multifaceted attention toward the planet they had cataloged as Specimen 734, known to its inhabitants as Earth. They dispatched an emissary, a being named Lyra, whose form was a shimmering cascade of sentient light, capable of slipping through the cracks of reality as easily as water through a sieve. Lyra's mission was not to make contact, but to observe and understand. It descended into the planet's nascent digital network, a chaotic jumble of wires and signals that humans called the Internet. And, for a time, it was merely confused. The data was a torrent of contradictions. For every symphony composed, there was a broadcast of a public execution. For every poem about love, there were 1,000 treatises on new and more efficient ways to kill. Humans built monuments to peace with one hand and assembly lines for war machines with the other. They wept for fictional characters on screens and ignored the real suffering of their neighbors. Lyra analyzed their history, a relentless, cyclical pattern of war, brief periods of exhausted peace, and then more war, each conflict more brutal and technologically savage than the last. Their entire evolutionary trajectory seemed to be a sprint, not toward enlightenment, but toward a more spectacular form of suicide. Lyra's initial report back to the collective was concise. Specimen 734 is a paradox. Its capacity for creation is matched only by its devotion to annihilation. They are a fever in a small, isolated system, and like all fevers, they will eventually break and burn themselves out. They pose no threat. The collective agreed. They had seen it 1,000 times before. The planet was a tragedy, but a minor and contained one. What Lyra failed to grasp, what the collective's serene logic could not compute, was that humanity didn't treat its fever as an illness. It treated it as a forge. The observer watched as the planet's latest global conflict, a grinding war between two major power blocks known as the Coalition and the Alliance, reached a grim tipping point. The Alliance was losing. Its armies were broken, its cities were being encircled, and its command structure was in disarray. According to every model the Lumina had ever devised, the outcome was certain unconditional surrender, followed by societal collapse. But the surrender never came. Instead, from the deepest, most desperate laboratories of the Alliance, something new emerged. It wasn't a bigger bomb or a faster jet. It was a weapon born of pure, spiteful ingenuity. They called it Cerberus, a mimetic pathogen designed not to kill the body, but to dismantle the soul. Lyra watched, its consciousness a silent node in the Alliance's battle network, as they unleashed it. The first target was General Valerius of the Coalition, a man renowned for his iron will and unflinching strategy. As he stood over a holographic command table, planning his final assault, the air in his command bunker suddenly grew cold. The voice of his daughter, who had died of a fever 5 years prior, whispered from the room's intercom, asking why he had let her die. His tactical displays flickered, showing not enemy positions, but the ghostly faces of every soldier who had ever died under his command, their eyes accusing. The lights in the bunker began to pulse in time with a slow, deliberate heartbeat that only he could hear. Within an hour, the unshakable General Valerius was found in his chambers, weeping and incoherent, having gouged out his own eyes to stop seeing the faces. The effect cascaded through the Coalition's command chain. A logistics officer was inundated with phantom reports of supply convoys driving into the sea, their drivers laughing madly over the radio. An entire squadron of fighter pilots simultaneously experienced crippling vertigo, their cockpit instruments telling them they were flying upside down into the earth. The Coalition's advanced battle AI began speaking in tongues, rewriting its own code into rambling, apocalyptic poetry. Cerberus didn't defeat the Coalition's army. It drove it insane. It took their greatest strength, their rigid, logical, technologically integrated military, and turned it into a self-consuming engine of terror. The Alliance didn't win through superior force. They won by whispering nightmares into the machine. The war ended not with a treaty, but with the mass psychological collapse of an entire military superpower. Lyra, the Lumina emissary, felt the psychic shockwave of that collapse even from its non-physical state. This wasn't war. It was a perversion, a weaponization of grief, of fear, of sanity itself. It was a form of violence the collective had never conceived of, because no species they had ever encountered had possessed the intimate, self-loathing understanding of its own psychological frailties required to invent it. Lyra's second report to the collective was radically different from the first. My assessment was an error. Specimen 734 does not burn out. It adapts. They have turned the mind itself into a battlefield. They are not a fever, they are a virus, one that has just learned to infect consciousness. We have miscategorized them. They are not primitive. They are nascent gods of madness. This time, the Lumina Collective did not file the report away. A disquiet, an emotion so alien to their nature that they barely had a concept for it, rippled through their shared consciousness. They had always believed that the path to a species' ascension was paved with logic and peace. Humanity suggested another, terrifying possibility that a species could crawl its way to the stars on a ladder made of broken minds. The decision was unanimous. Observation was no longer sufficient. They needed to understand the source of this power, this uniquely human brand of brilliant, terrifying insanity. They needed a specimen. Lyra's digital probes sifted through the wreckage of the war, searching for the perfect candidate. It needed to be a human who embodied this paradox of resilience and brutality. The search algorithm settled on one individual, a soldier, not a general or a hero celebrated on the news, but a ghost. A name that appeared only in redacted after-action reports and the hushed whispers of intelligence analysts. He was an Alliance operative who had spent the entire war deep in Coalition territory, a one-man insurgency who had dismantled supply lines, sabotaged infrastructure, and eliminated key targets with such ruthless efficiency that coalition commanders had believed they were being hunted by an entire phantom battalion. He had no official name, only a call sign whispered in fear and awe: Kane. The Lumina's data indicated Kane was currently isolated, operating in the icy ruins of a fallen mountain city, the perfect location for a quiet, clinical extraction. A new vessel was dispatched from the Collective's fleet, a sleek, silent craft that could bend light and gravity around its hull. It was not a warship. It was a collector's vessel, equipped with stasis fields and teleporters, designed for the gentle acquisition of biological samples. The Collective's logic was flawless. They would retrieve the specimen, study its biology and psychology, and understand the anomaly. They would be careful, precise, and completely undetected. It was a simple, low-risk operation. They did not understand that in targeting Kane, they were not collecting a sample of the virus. They were reaching directly into the forge and grabbing the hammer that had shaped it. A hammer that was still white-hot and knew only one thing: how to strike back. As the Lumina vessel slipped into the planet's atmosphere, a predator descending on what it believed to be sleeping prey. It was utterly blind to the fact that its prey never slept. It was simply waiting for a bigger fight. The city was a corpse laid out in a coffin of ice. Once, it had been a jewel of the Alliance, a mountaintop metropolis of glittering spires and sky bridges. Now, it was a graveyard, its towers shattered teeth gnawing at a perpetually gray sky. Kane moved through its frozen arteries, not like a man, but like a whisper of the cold itself. He was not here for salvage or sentiment. He was hunting the city's ghosts. After the Coalition's collapse, many of their most fanatical commanders had refused to accept the new reality. They had scattered, going to ground in the war's forgotten corners, nursing their shattered certainties and plotting their return. One of them, a specialist in counterinsurgency known as Commander Falk, had burrowed deep into the ruins of this city with a handful of loyalists. Kane's mission was simple: to ensure Falk's ghost never learned to howl again. He was crouched in the husk of a grand library, the frozen pages of 1,000,000 books crunching like fallen leaves under his boots. His senses were stretched thin, a web of perception laid across the ruins. He tasted the metallic tang of ozone on the wind, a sign of a jury-rigged power generator nearby. He heard the faint, rhythmic crunch of a patrol's boots 2 levels below. But there was something else, a note in the symphony of decay that was jarringly wrong. It was the silence, not the heavy, muffled silence of a snow-blanketed city, but a deep, profound unsound, as if a piece of the world had been surgically removed. The snowfall, which had been a steady, lazy drift, suddenly seemed to hang in the air, each flake frozen in place, a foot from the broken stained glass window he was watching. Kane didn't question it. He reacted. He was already moving before his conscious mind had processed the impossibility, diving behind a massive, overturned marble lectern. The world outside the window dissolved. It wasn't a flash of light or an explosion of force. It was a quiet, sickening unraveling. The gray sky, the ruined towers, the very air itself seemed to fold inward, replaced by a non-space, a patch of shimmering, colorless void. From this tear in reality, an invisible pressure descended, a force that didn't push, but simply was. It sought to hold him, to pin him like an insect in amber. A stasis field. His muscles screamed as they tried to obey commands that were no longer reaching them. His vision tunneled. This wasn't Coalition tech. It wasn't human. It was something else. Something clean and cold and utterly confident. As the field tightened, threatening to snap his consciousness like a dry twig, his hand, moving with the agonizing slowness of a glacier, found the last non-standard piece of gear on his belt. It was a relic from an older, dirtier war, a thermobaric flare. It was a primitive tool, designed to blind primitive optical sensors and create a massive, instantaneous pressure wave. With the last dregs of his motor control, he thumbed the activator. The flare didn't just ignite, it detonated. A sun bloomed in the frozen library, a sudden, violent rebuttal to the sterile, silent attack. The stasis field, designed to contain the orderly physics of a living organism, had no protocol for a sudden, chaotic release of pure thermal and kinetic energy. It flickered, its invisible geometry shattering like glass. The Lumina vessel, hovering invisibly in the upper atmosphere, registered the event not as a threat, but as an error. The specimen had self-immolated, an unexpected, but ultimately acceptable loss. The ship's automated systems moved to retrieve the collection drone, which was now just a molten lump of exotic alloys. A focused beam of trans-dimensional energy lanced down to teleport the wreckage back for analysis. It was this beam that Kane had been waiting for. He hadn't set off the flare to escape. He had set it off to create a target. As the beam enveloped the slagged remains of the drone, Kane, his suit smoking and his skin blistered, threw himself into its path. For the briefest fraction of a second, the ship's logic gates screamed in protest. The teleportation matrix was calibrated for a specific mass and energy signature. Kane was an anomaly, a chaotic variable forced into a perfect equation. The system tried to reject him, to tear him apart atom by atom, but his sheer, stubborn momentum and the residual energy of the flare were enough to corrupt the sequence. The world dissolved into a nauseating shriek of light and color, and then solidified. He landed hard on a floor that felt like polished bone, in a place that smelled of nothing at all. He was inside. The corridor, if it could be called that, was a seamless, flowing curve of soft, white light. There were no panels, no wires, no rivets. It was as if the entire structure had been grown, not built, and he was not alone. Two figures drifted toward him. They were not humanoid. One was a tall, crystalline pillar, its interior a slow swirl of captured galaxies. The other was a being of pure, woven sound, its form a shimmering, harmonious, standing wave. They were the ship's curators, its scientists. And their reaction to Kane's sudden, violent arrival was not aggression, but a deep, resounding sense of utter confusion. They had come to collect a microbe and had ended up with the plague itself on their sterile petri dish. Kane didn't give them time to process. He ripped a jagged shard of support strut from the wall where the teleportation energy had buckled it. It came away with a soft, melodic chime and lunged. The being of sound dissolved into a discordant shriek as he slashed through it. The crystalline entity simply shattered, its fall echoing like 1,000 tiny bells. There was no blood, no gore, just the clean, quiet cessation of existence. An alarm finally sounded, not a siren, but a wave of palpable sorrow that washed through the ship's corridors. Doors, which were merely irises of light, began to seal. Kane moved with a predator's economy, ignoring the dead ends, guided by a primal sense of direction. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to find the heart of the vessel. He knew, with an instinct honed in 100 kill zones, that a creature this complex had to have a brain. He found it in a vast, spherical chamber where the walls were a living star chart. At its center floated Lyra, the emissary, a being of incandescent, intelligent light. Its attention focused on the wound Kane had torn in its ship. It turned, its form coalescing slightly, and a voice entered Kane's mind. It was not a voice of words, but of pure concepts query. Anomaly. Unscheduled biological transfer. Explain. Lyra's attempt at communication was its second critical error. It opened a pathway into Kane's mind, expecting to find the simple, linear thoughts of a primitive organism. Instead, it found a fortress. A consciousness fortified by scar tissue and barbed wire, where every memory was a landmine and every thought was a razor. Kane didn't just block the intrusion, he welcomed it. He let the alien in, and then he unleashed his own ghosts. He fed Lyra the memory of his first kill, the feeling of the warm blood on his hands, and the cold certainty in his gut. He showed it the terror in Commander Falk's eyes as he cornered him in the library moments before the ship had arrived. He flooded the psychic link with the raw, undiluted essence of human conflict, the bitter triumph, the gnawing guilt, the adrenaline-fueled joy of survival, the quiet, soul-destroying horror of it all. He projected the core principle of the Cerberus pathogen directly into the alien's mind, the idea that sanity was not a state of being, but a weapon to be broken and used against your enemy. Lyra, the serene, logical being of light, reeled. It had no defense against this kind of assault. The pure, chaotic emotions of a human soul, concentrated into a single, weaponized consciousness, were a poison for which it had no antidote. It experienced, for the first time in its millennia-long existence, the crippling sensation of fear. Its light flickered, dimmed, and its control over the ship wavered. The seamless white walls of the vessel began to show static, glitching in and out of existence. The melodic hum of its systems twisted into a pained, atonal groan. Kane used the moment of chaos. He saw what he was looking for, a small, glowing data node humming near Lyra's faltering form. It was a memory core, a repository of the ship's observations. He lunged, his hand closing around the crystalline object. It was warm, and it vibrated with a universe of information. Then he ran. He found a cargo bay, where other specimens floated in serene, golden stasis bubbles, a silicon-based life form from a gas giant, a plant that sang to its sons, a creature of living stone. They were all perfect, placid samples. He was the sample that had broken the jar and was now setting fire to the laboratory. He smashed his fist against a shimmering containment field that looked out into the void. It held for a moment. Then, under the strain of the ship's failing systems, it burst. The vacuum of space screamed into the bay, pulling everything out into the cold darkness. Kane held his breath, his suit automatically sealing, and kicked off the deck plating, launching himself into the void. Below him, the Lumina Collector's vessel, no longer invisibly cloaked, shimmered violently. It looked wounded, violated. Then, with a silent flash of distorted light, it vanished, retreating back to its own pristine reality, taking its newfound infection with it. Kane began to fall, a tiny speck of defiant life tumbling back toward the frozen, broken world that had made him. He clutched the Lumina data core in his fist, its alien light pulsing against his glove like a second, captured heartbeat. The hunt for a ghost in a dead city was over. A new, infinitely larger hunt had just begun. The fall was a quiet apocalypse. For a human without a suit, the descent from near orbit would have been a quick, brutal end. But Kane's gear was a product of the Alliance's desperate ingenuity, a second skin of reactive polymers and compressed air thrusters designed for high-altitude insertions, not atmospheric re-entry. It wasn't meant for this. The suit's outer layers ablated, burning away in sizzling protest against the friction. Alarms shrieked directly into the bones of his skull, a frantic litany of system failures and pressure warnings. He ignored them. He was a stone skipping across the roof of the world, his trajectory a fiery, uncontrolled arc across the sky. He steered with his body, a crude and violent form of aerobraking, forcing the angle of his descent from a lethal vertical drop into something resembling a long, suicidal glide. He aimed for the vast, gray expanse of the Northern Ocean, a final, desperate gamble. Hitting water from this height was like hitting concrete, but it was better than becoming a crater in the frozen tundra. The impact was a physical thunderclap, a bone-shattering concussion that knocked the world black. The suit, its integrity finally breached, flooded with impossibly cold water. His last conscious thought was not of survival, but of the glowing Lumina core clutched in his hand. He had to protect the wound he had inflicted on the heavens. He woke up adrift, not in the water, but in the gray, sterile confines of a medical bay. The rhythmic beep of a vital signs monitor was the first sound to pierce the fog. He was alive, though every inch of his body felt like a fresh bruise. A figure stood over him, her face etched with a familiar mixture of clinical concern and weary exasperation. It was Dr. Eris Thorne, the Alliance's foremost expert in unconventional biology, and, more importantly, the only person Kane trusted to stitch him back together. Her voice was as dry as the recycled air in the subterranean facility. You know, for a ghost, you make an awful lot of noise. We tracked your re-entry signature from the moment you hit the atmosphere. It looked like a meteor had decided to commit suicide. What the hell did you do up there? Kane didn't answer immediately. He sat up, ignoring the protest of his abused muscles, and his gaze fell on his own hand. It was bandaged, but he could feel the faint, rhythmic pulse of the object he had been holding. He looked at Aris, his eyes clear and cold. "I went fishing," he said. "And I think I caught a god." The facility was Site Omega, a black hole on any official map, a place where the Alliance dissected its nightmares to see how they ticked. It was here that Cerberus had been born, and it was here that they brought the Lumina data core. The object itself was a marvel, a perfect teardrop-shaped crystal that seemed to absorb and refract light in impossible ways. It didn't interface with any of their technology. It sat on the examination table in a sterile containment field, humming with a silent, unknowable energy. "It's not just a storage device," Aris murmured, her eyes glued to a holographic display showing the core's energy fluctuations. "It's alive. The data isn't stored in a binary system. It's encoded in the quantum state of the crystal's lattice. It's a library built out of reality itself. For 2 weeks, they tried to crack it. They bombarded it with every decryption algorithm they had. They subjected it to magnetic fields, radiation, sonic pulses. The core remained inert, a perfect, infuriatingly serene puzzle. Kane, recovered but restless, watched the proceedings with a growing sense of impatience. He had felt the alien's mind. He knew this was a battle they couldn't win with logic. "You're trying to pick a lock," he said one day, standing at the edge of the containment chamber. "But it's not a lock. It's an eye. And it's closed." Eris turned, her frustration evident. "Then how do we open it?" Kane, "Do you suggest we threaten it with one of your knives?" "No," he said, his gaze fixed on the pulsing crystal. "You don't threaten it. You show it something it wants to see." He walked to the control panel, overriding the safety protocols. The containment field flickered and died. He stepped onto the platform and did the last thing any scientist would have considered. He reached out and touched the core. But he didn't just touch it with his hand. He touched it with his mind. He didn't try to force his way in. He opened a door in his own consciousness, the same door he had opened for Lyra, and he let the core look inside. He showed it a memory, not of war or death, but of something far more complex. He remembered standing on a rain-slicked street in a city long since turned to dust, watching a street musician play a violin. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a simple human expression of sorrow and hope that had, for a fleeting moment, made the war-torn world fall away. It was a memory of a beauty so profound and so pointless that it defied all logic. The core responded. A soft, blue light bloomed from its center, and the air in the chamber grew thick with information. It wasn't a data stream that flowed into their computers. It was a vision that bloomed in their minds. They saw the galaxy, not as a collection of stars, but as a carefully tended garden. They saw the Lumina Collective, a species of beings who had transcended physical form to become silent, eternal observers. Their purpose to guide the cosmos toward a state of perfect, harmonious order they called the Serenity. They saw the species the Lumina had pruned races of aggressive conquerors, psychic parasites, beings who consume stars, all of them deemed to be weeds in the cosmic garden. And then they saw themselves, humanity. Specimen 734. They were not categorized as a weed. They were categorized as a disease, a chaotic, unpredictable blight that had emerged from a forgotten corner of the garden, a mutation that threatened the very concept of the Serenity. The Lumina didn't want to destroy them. Destruction was messy, disorderly. They wanted to cure them, to study them, understand the source of their chaotic nature, and then re-engineer them, stripping them of the very things, the ambition, the rage, the illogical passions, the capacity for both transcendent art and senseless cruelty that made them human. The vision ended, leaving the scientists in the room, pale and shaken. The truth was far more terrifying than an invasion. They weren't facing an enemy who wanted their planet or their resources. They were facing a gardener who saw them as a patch of beautifully colored, but ultimately poisonous, flowers that needed to be uprooted before they spread their seeds. General Maddox, the grizzled commander of Alliance Special Projects and the man who held Kane's leash, stood in the observation deck above, his face grim. "So, they're not warriors," he said, his voice a low growl. "They're doctors. And we're the patient strapped to the table, about to be lobotomized for our own good." Eris looked up at him, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "It's worse than that. Sir, the Corps showed us their reach. They have outposts, observation nodes, hidden throughout the entire quadrant. They've been watching us for centuries. They know our biology. our history, our psychology. They know us better than we know ourselves. It was Kane who broke the stunned silence. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the fear in the room. "They know our data. They don't know us." He turned to Maddox. "They made a mistake. They sent one ship, a collector. They thought we were a specimen to be cataloged. Now they know we're a threat. But they're arrogant. They believe they're untouchable, that we can't reach them in their sterile, perfect reality. They'll send something else next time. Not a collector, but a surgeon. Something to cut the infection out before it can spread." Maddox's jaw tightened. And how do we fight an enemy that can rewrite reality and teleport across the stars? Kane picked up the data core. Its light was now a steady, soft blue, its eye open and watching him. "We don't fight them on their terms," he said. "We don't build a bigger fleet or a better gun. We do what we've always done. We find their weakness, and we build a better nightmare." He looked from Eris's fearful face to Maddox's hardened glare. "They've been studying us. It's time we started studying them." The data core was more than a warning. It was a map to the enemy's mind, to their technology, to the hidden pathways they used to slip between the stars. The Alliance had just been handed the keys to the asylum, and Kane was about to show the doctors what true madness looked like. The war that followed was not fought in the skies or on any battlefield Earth had ever known. It was a war of whispers and shadows, waged in the liminal spaces between realities. Armed with the knowledge from the Lumina core, Site Omega transformed from a research facility into the nerve center of a new kind of insurgency. They didn't build warships, they built viruses. Not computer viruses, but conceptual ones, designed to infect the serene, logical reality of the collective. Eris Thorne and her team became architects of ontological weapons. They learned to mimic the Lumina's ability to manipulate space-time, but they didn't use it to build or travel. They used it to break things. Their first successful test was small, almost petty. They located a Lumina observation node hidden in the Oort cloud, a silent crystalline sentinel that had been monitoring Earth since the Age of Steam. They didn't destroy it. Instead, they used a focused resonance beam to introduce a single, flawed mathematical concept into its core, programming the number 0 to the Lumina, whose mathematics was based on the pure, harmonious principles of existence. The concept of a value representing absolute nothingness was a logical paradox, a piece of cognitive poison. The Sentinel, unable to compute this impossible idea, simply ceased to be, its crystalline structure dissolving into a cloud of inert dust. It was a pinprick, but it was a start. They had learned to speak the enemy's language, and their first word was a curse. While Eris's team weaponized metaphysics, Kane went hunting. The data core was a map, and on that map were pathways, trans-dimensional routes the Lumina used to move their ships and probes. They were like secret, hidden currents in the ocean of space-time. Maddox, against his better judgment, but with no other viable options, sanctioned Kane's proposal to build a vessel capable of navigating these currents. The ship they built was an abomination, a fusion of salvage Lumina alloys and brutalist Alliance engineering. It was not designed for elegance or comfort. It was a spike, a stiletto, a jagged piece of human defiance designed to be plunged into the soft, sterile heart of the enemy. They called it the Stray Dog. It had no crew, save for Kane. Its navigation was handled by a semi-sentient AI that had been partially lobotomized to prevent it from going insane from the paradoxical physics of trans-dimensional travel. And its primary weapon was Kane himself. His first mission was to be a ghost in their machine. He took the stray dog into the Lumina's pathways and began to raise hell. He didn't engage their vessels directly. He was a saboteur, a phantom wreaking havoc on their pristine infrastructure. He would emerge from a dimensional fold just long enough to attach a logic bomb to one of their relay stations, a device that broadcasted not energy, but chaotic human emotions, rage, jealousy, grief, love. The Lumina systems, designed for pure, untroubled data, would choke on the raw, unstructured noise, causing cascading failures across their network. He visited a Lumina nursery, a nebula where they were gently coaxing the evolution of a new silicon-based species, and introduced a simple, recursive loop of a human lullaby into the nebula's resonant frequency. The gentle, harmonious growth of the silicon lifeforms was disrupted, their crystalline structures growing into jagged, chaotic patterns. He found one of their vast, silent archives, a moon-sized crystal containing the historical records of 1,000 extinct species, and seeded it with the most potent human idea he could think of a lie. The archive, which had only ever known objective truth, began to corrupt, its perfect historical records fracturing into 1,000,000 conflicting, unreliable narratives. He was a vandal in a cathedral, scrawling graffiti on their holy texts, smashing their stained glass windows. He was injecting pure, undiluted humanity into their perfect, ordered universe. The Lumina Collective, for the first time in its ageless existence, was forced to react. Their garden was infested with a weed that was not only poisonous, but actively malicious. They began to deploy countermeasures. They sent purifiers, beings of focused, coherent light designed to patrol their pathways and erase anomalies. Kane's skirmishes with these entities were not battles of firepower, but of will. The purifiers would attempt to unmake him, to dissolve his ship and his body into their component atoms by sheer force of logical certainty. Kane fought back with the only weapon he had: his own stubborn, illogical refusal to cease existing. He would broadcast his own memories at them, the grime of a trench, the taste of cheap whiskey, the feeling of a broken bone filling their pure, conceptual space with the messy, painful, glorious static of a human life. More often than not, the purifiers would simply retreat, unable to process the sheer volume of chaotic, contradictory information. He was too real for them. Back on Earth, the strain was beginning to show. Maintaining the ontological weapons and the trans-dimensional gateway for the stray dog was draining Site Omega's resources. General Maddox was facing increasing pressure from the remnants of the Alliance High Command, who saw his shadow war as a reckless gamble that could bring an unimaginable retribution down upon them. "We are poking a god with a sharp stick, Kane," Maddox said over a secure, quantum-entangled comms link, his face a mask of exhaustion. Kane was in the cockpit of the stray dog, the swirling, non-Euclidean geometry of a Lumina pathway visible on his view screen. "A god that wants to geld us," Kane replied, his voice flat. "This is the only way. We have to show them that trying to cure us will be more painful than leaving us alone. We have to make the disease more terrifying than the death." It was on his 7th sortie that Kane found what he was looking for. The data core had hinted at a central hub, a primary node through which the Lumina coordinated their network for the entire galactic sector. They called it the Well of Serenity. It was not a space station or a planet, but a pocket dimension, a perfectly stable, self-contained universe of pure thought where the regional consciousness of the collective resided. It was their command center, their sanctuary, their soul. It was also, Kane surmised, their greatest vulnerability. Attacking it directly was impossible. The defenses were not physical, but conceptual. To even approach it, a being had to have a mind in a state of perfect serenity, a feat no human could ever achieve. But Kane wasn't planning a direct assault. He had a far more insidious idea, one born from the dark heart of the Cerberus Project. He wasn't going to attack the well. He was going to give it a gift. He communicated his plan to Site Omega. Eris Thorne listened, her face growing paler with each word. Kane, what you're describing, it's a soul killer. We developed the theory during the Cerberus Project, but we never built it. It's too monstrous. The weapon was designed to create a self-sustaining psychic paradox, an idea that, once introduced into a consciousness, would cause it to endlessly question its own existence, turning its own logic against itself until it collapsed into a state of cognitive non-existence. It was the mental equivalent of a black hole. They see us as a disease, Kane said, his voice quiet but unyielding. It's time we showed them the symptoms. The debate inside Omega was brief and brutal, but in the end, Maddox gave the order. They would build it. They would build this final terrible weapon as the stray dog drifted in the silent, swirling currents of a hidden pathway, waiting for the weapon to be completed. Kane looked out at the impossible beauty of the alien dimension. He felt a strange, hollow ache. For all their arrogance, the Lumina were trying to create a universe without pain, without chaos, without suffering. They were trying to build a heaven, and he, in order to save the flawed, broken, beautiful mess that was humanity, was about to teach them the true meaning of hell. The final battle would not be for territory or for survival. It would be for the soul of the universe itself. The weapon, when it was finally delivered through the fragile umbilical of the dimensional gateway, did not look like a weapon at all. It was a small, inert, black cube, perfectly smooth and cold to the touch. It contained no explosives, no biological agents, no radiating energy. Its destructive potential was purely conceptual, a piece of weaponized philosophy. Eris, her face a pale ghost on Kane's comm screen, gave him the final briefing. "We call it the Labyrinth," she said, her voice strained. "Once activated, it will unfold into a recursive mimetic sequence. It doesn't attack the Lumina's consciousness. It offers it a puzzle, a koan based on the flawed, paradoxical nature of human self-awareness to a purely logical mind. It's an unsolvable problem. To solve it, they would have to learn to embrace contradiction, to accept illogic, to become, in a small way, human, and if they can't, it will break them from the inside out," Kane finished for her. "Good." He severed the connection before she could voice the question that hung in her eyes. What kind of man could conceive of such a thing? Let alone deploy it. Navigating to the Well of Serenity was the final, brutal test for both the stray dog and its pilot. The pathways grew more abstract, the laws of physics becoming mere suggestions. The ship's hull groaned as it was squeezed through dimensions no thicker than a thought. The AI navigator screamed in a silent language of pure mathematics, its logic circuits fraying. Kane held it all together through sheer, bloody-minded will. He was no longer just a pilot. He was the anchor, the single point of stubborn, physical reality in a sea of abstraction. He finally emerged into a space that defied description. He was in the well. It was not a place, but a state of being. The sky was a boundless, gentle, golden light, and the ground was a tranquil sea of pure consciousness, the Gestalt mind of the Lumina. There were no ships, no defenses, just a perfect, unending calm. The air itself hummed with a harmony so profound it threatened to erase his own discordant thoughts, to smooth the jagged edges of his soul and absorb him into its peace. This, he realized, was their ultimate defense. Not a wall, but an invitation to surrender, to cease the struggle and simply be. He felt his own anger, his pain, the very core of his identity, beginning to dissolve like salt in water. The temptation to let go, to finally find peace after a lifetime of war, was an agonizing, physical pull. He fought it the only way he knew how. He remembered. He dredged up the ugliest, most painful memories. He had the smell of burning cities, the weight of a dying comrade in his arms, the hollow look in a child's eyes in a refugee camp. He held on to his scars, his guilt, his rage, using them as a shield against the crushing serenity. He was an island of pure, refined agony in an ocean of peace. The Lumina consciousness stirred, its attention turning toward this small, painful anomaly that had appeared in its sanctum. A presence, impossibly vast and ancient, coalesced before him. It was not Lyra. It was the core consciousness of the collective itself, its voice a symphony of a million minds speaking as one in his thoughts. "You are broken," it said, not with malice, but with a deep, sorrowful pity. You're a song of discord in the heart of the universal hymn. Allow us to heal you. Allow us to make you whole. You don't want to heal me, Kane projected back, his thoughts a jagged shard of defiance. You want to erase me. You're afraid of the notes you don't understand. He held up the labyrinth. The black cube seemed to drink the golden light around it. Your chaos is a disease. It leads only to suffering and extinction. The collective replied, its serene presence beginning to focus, to exert a gentle but irresistible pressure. We have seen this 1,000 times. The pattern is always the same. Then it's time you saw a new pattern, Kane said. He activated the cube. It did not explode. It unfolded. It opened like a black, geometric flower, releasing not energy, but a single, silent question into the heart of the Lumina mind. The question was simple in its structure, but infinite in its implications. If a perfect creator designs a flawed creation, is the flaw a mistake, or a part of the perfection for a purely logical, harmonious consciousness? The question was a paradox without solution. It was a serpent eating its own tail. The serene sea of thought began to ripple, then churn. The golden light of the well flickered, tainted with shades of gray, of doubt. The collective's voice fractured, a million minds suddenly wrestling with a concept they could not process. The idea of a flaw being intentional, of chaos being a necessary component of order, of pain being a part of beauty. It was the essence of humanity, and it was tearing their perfect, logical heaven apart. The well of serenity began to collapse. The pocket dimension destabilized, its walls of reality groaning and cracking. Kane had to get out. He turned the stray dog back toward the chaotic, bleeding wound in space-time through which he had entered. But the collective was not yet broken. A single tendril of its consciousness, a last, desperate effort of a dying god, lashed out. It didn't try to destroy him. It tried to show him the truth. Kane's mind was flooded with a vision, not from his own past, but from theirs. He saw the birth of the Lumina, eons ago. They were not always beings of light. They had once been a physical species, much like humans, passionate, flawed, and constantly at war. He saw their world burn, saw them drive themselves to the brink of extinction through their own chaotic passions. He saw the survivors who, in their grief and terror, made a choice. They would transcend their flawed, physical forms. They would strip themselves of emotion, of ambition, of individuality, all the things that had led to their self-destruction. They would become beings of pure logic and order, guardians to ensure no other species would ever suffer the same fate. They had not become gardeners out of arrogance. They had become gardeners out of fear. They were not trying to lobotomize humanity. They were trying to save humanity from itself, using the only method they knew. The vision ended, leaving Kane adrift in the cockpit of his dying ship, the truth a cold weight in his chest. He had not been fighting a tyrant. He had been fighting a traumatized, overprotective parent who was trying to put a child in a cage to keep it from burning itself on the stove. With a final wrenching tear, the stray dog burst back into the chaotic reality of the pathways, leaving the collapsing well behind it. The ship was crippled, its systems failing. Kane was bleeding from the nose and ears, the psychic feedback threatening to shatter his mind. He had won. He had broken the heart of the collective, plunged their entire civilization into a chaos of self-doubt from which they might never recover. But the victory felt like ashes in his mouth. He had saved humanity's freedom to be flawed, to be chaotic, to be gloriously, terribly human. But the Lumina's final vision had shown him the bill for that freedom. It was a price his own species had paid 100 times over and would likely pay again. He managed to guide the crippled ship back to the gateway, crashing through into the frozen plains of Antarctica. The rescue teams found him unconscious in the wreckage, the black, inert cube of the labyrinth still clutched in his hand. In the aftermath, the Lumina vanished. Their ships retreated from their pathways. Their observation nodes went dark. The garden had been abandoned, left to grow wild. Humanity was alone again, free to chart its own course to the stars. On Earth. Kane was a ghost once more, his existence scrubbed from every record. He had won the war, but he had lost any chance at peace. He would forever carry the knowledge of what he had done, the terrible truth of their enemy, and the terrible price of their victory. He often walked the crowded streets of the rebuilt cities, a solitary, unseen figure amidst the vibrant, chaotic, endlessly striving river of humanity. He would see an artist painting a mural, a couple arguing passionately on a corner, a child crying, a scientist staring at the stars with wonder, and he would feel the weight of it all. He had saved this, all of it, the beauty and the ugliness, the genius and the madness. He had fought a god of order to preserve his people's right to be chaotic, and as he watched them, he was haunted by the labyrinth's final, unspoken question: had he unleashed his species upon the galaxy, Or had he just condemned them to a prison of their own making? A prison with no walls, only mirrors. The war was over, but the human struggle, he knew, had only just begun.